Okay, if you're here early, congratulations. I'm just getting things set up a little bit, and we'll be ready to go right at 9:30. If you know of classmates who aren't here and who should be here and who might not have gotten my messages, you can go ahead and reach out to them however you can. Shoot them a text or whatever. So we'll be ready to go in about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. All right, good morning. Welcome to our U.S. History live online class. We are covering the 1950s and 60s today. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we have together. We pray that you bless our time and bless our understanding of the truth. Help us to be discerning and wise and responsible with what you teach us, to use it for your glory in this world and for the spread of your gospel, and as faithful ambassadors for Christ to a culture that needs you. We pray this, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, 1950s and 60s America. There are few places. Let me just do something real quick here. No. All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Shoot a little comment in the little live chat area to let me know that you're here and that you can hear me. Nate Young is in the house. All by himself? No, because there are 6 people watching. So 5 people either can't hear me or don't want to put something in the chat box or don't know how. That's okay. All right, let's go back to our lesson this morning. 1950s and 60s America. There are a few time periods in American history that are more iconic than the 50s and 60s. We kind of have in our mind an image, right, of what life was like in the 50s, sort of Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, suburban America, clean cut, short hair. Everybody wore a suit everywhere they went. I mean, look at this family in the car going to church on Sunday. Isn't that what your family looks like going to church on Sunday? And then the 1960s, of course, protests and civil rights demonstrations and Vietnam War protests and hippies and Woodstock. But there's a lot more to these decades in American history than just the sort of stereotypical images, although those things are part of what was happening at that time, for sure. But the 1950s and 60s were a time of great prosperity, a time of great growth, a time of increasing conflict, and then a time of great change. So the 1950s, you see the billboard, world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And it is true, as much as that's sort of stereotypical, that after World War II, you see so many of the countries in the world were devastated by what happened in World War II. And America really emerged pretty much unscathed because, other than Pearl Harbor, there were no attacks on American soil. And even Hawaii, was not a state yet when it was attacked at Pearl Harbor. Certainly that was an attack on us, but Hawaii was not a state until 1959. So this is actually the time period also when we get our last two states, Alaska and Hawaii, both come in 1959 during these decades. So what are we going to focus on? Well, we can't talk about everything. We don't have an unlimited amount of time, and your brains wouldn't be able to hold it anyway. So we're going to kind of run through the most important things, right? So there are 12 important events of the 1950s and 60s that I want you to sort of be aware of. So this would be a good time to sort of make some notes. You might see these things on a test in the future, perhaps, or something like that. So 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected. Eisenhower, of course, was the hero of World War II. He was the one who led the D-Day invasion. He was the commander of American forces in Europe. Douglas MacArthur, who commanded U.S. forces in the Pacific, would never become president. He was not much of a politician, got himself removed from leading the American military during the Korean War because he decided to have a power struggle with Harry Truman. So we'll talk about that when we get to the Korean War. So Eisenhower, I like Ike. That was the campaign slogan. And everybody seemed to like Ike. Eisenhower's a guy who's pretty hard to dislike. You don't have to agree with everything he did, but he was a pretty likable guy and a very effective leader. The Korean War took place in the first 3 years of this time period, 1950 to 53. It was the first hot flash of the Cold War. 1954, one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in the history of our country, Brown versus Board of Education, basically overturned the earlier decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. You might remember from the 1890s, Plessy versus Ferguson said you could have separate public accommodations for whites and for colored as long as they were equal. So you could have separate but equal. And that's what justified separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate train cars, separate sections on the bus, separate schools. All public accommodations could be separate under Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, Brown versus Board of Education decided to reverse that. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't have it separate because by the nature of being separate, it is going to be unequal. By telling a certain group of people that they have to learn separately from everybody else, or drink water separately from everybody else, or use the bathroom separately from everybody else, you are by necessity making it unequal. And so that led to the integration of all public aspects of life. Didn't immediately lead to the integration of private businesses like restaurants, even bathrooms that were at private establishments. They weren't integrated until later. That would take the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we'll talk about as well. So, Brown versus Board, 1954, the end of separate but equal, and required the integration of schools. 1957, so it took years in some cases for these things to work themselves out. 1957, Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas was desegregated. That was a very famous time. 1957 also, you have the Soviets launching Sputnik, the first satellite, and that began the space race, which would really last until 1969, when the United States would win the space race by landing a man on the moon. 1959, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. So Cuba becomes a communist stronghold 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida. That was a big deal in the early 1960s. It still is a big deal, but it was more pressing in the headlines in the early 1960s. In 1960, John F. Kennedy became elected as president. 61 and 62, there were two major events. I'm kind of putting them together, both dealing with Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson sends combat troops to Vietnam. So President LBJ got us really into the combat role in Vietnam. In 1968, two very important figures were both assassinated in April and in May. RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, who had just won the California Democratic presidential primary and was very much being set up. He was going to be the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. Think of like Joe Biden today, right? He's in that kind of position. He's the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination. Everybody's expecting him to get it. All of a sudden, he's assassinated. And then Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And then 1969, the United States lands a man on the moon. So the chapter for today goes until 1974, which is, of course, a very great year. But we're not going to get that far today. So 1974, March 26th, 1974, on this day, great things happened for the world. Just kidding. All right. So let's talk about President Eisenhower for just a minute. President Eisenhower was president from 1953 to 1961. That means he won the 52 election and he won re-election in 56, but he served from 53 to 61. The best way to describe Eisenhower is that he's a moderate Republican, and everybody liked Ike. I like Ike. He was the hero of World War II. He was very level-headed. He was very moderate, just the very definition of moderate, okay? His real gifting as a leader was as a logistician, as a planner and organizer. Some of you are working on World War II papers on D-Day. Eisenhower was the lead planner. He was the commander of D-Day. That's a massive logistical undertaking. He brings that same kind of mindset to the presidency. He wants to plan and organize. Now, he doesn't want to control everything. He's not a socialist. He's not a central planner like FDR and wanting to try to be a socialist. But he does want to bring some more unity and some more cohesiveness. And one thing you know, when you are a logistician, I like to say that word, logistician. When you work in logistics, one thing you know is that transportation is incredibly important. Being able to get people, goods, material from point A to point B quickly, efficiently, effectively is very, very important. And Eisenhower, with his master planning mind, looked at our country and said, you know, our road system is really kind of a mess. Like, there's stoplights and streetlights, and you got to pass through small towns and cities, and, you know, everything's built up. And it's hard to get from, like, say, New York to Washington, D.C., or Washington, D.C. to Florida, or from Washington, D.C. to California in any sort of efficient way, because it's all sort of back roads and roads that go through towns and cities and stuff. So he's the one in 1956, this is probably his single greatest accomplishment. He's the one in 1956 who gave us our interstate highway system. So we have a wonderful interstate highway system, one of the best in the world, probably the best in the world, and it owes its origin to President Eisenhower. He also invested heavily in science education through the National Defense Education Act. So this was a time of the emerging of the Cold War, of course. We're in the early decades of the Cold War. And he knows that if we're going to stay ahead of the Soviets, if we're going to be competitive with them, we need to have students who are educated in science. So, there's this whole thing today about STEM education, right? In science and technology, engineering, mathematics. That's nothing new. We've been sort of realizing our need for that since the 1950s. The Civil Rights Bill of 1957 was another major accomplishment, but it wasn't really all that successful. What Eisenhower wanted to accomplish, particularly in the light of, Brown versus Board happens during his administration, and so he's wanting to really put into place this sort of integration of society. He commanded troops in World War II that were the first American troops to be integrated, racially integrated. So you had units that were mixed racially, and he saw that was a good thing. It was really good for the military, and so he tried to make it good for the country. But it wasn't really successful because Congress gutted most of the important provisions of the act, and so it became sort of mostly symbolic. He did end the Korean War in 1953. He also balanced the budget 3 times. Imagine that. The federal government having a balanced budget. Wow. It also happened most recently under Bill Clinton. In the last few years of Clinton's presidency, we had a balanced budget and even a federal budget surplus. That's hard to imagine today when we're running over $1 trillion a year in federal budget deficit, and the Congress is passing a $2 trillion COVID-19 relief package. So he ended the Korean War. He balanced the budget 3 times. Also, his era is remembered for Senator Joseph McCarthy and his anti-communism. So this is a really, really tricky part of American history to get the truth on, like what was really going on with Senator Joseph McCarthy and his crusade against communism. And also in the U.S. House, there was the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, and they were also hunting for communists. And I say it's difficult to get a handle on the truth because certainly there was some fear, there was some overreaction, there was an overly zealous pursuit of communists, looking for communists under every rock and behind every tree. But at the same time, as my dad used to say to me growing up, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, right? So just because we were sort of in an anti-communist paranoia doesn't mean that there were no communists around, that we were completely baseless. Because actually the communists were trying to infiltrate American universities and Hollywood, the entertainment industry, the news media. And part of what we see in the late 1960s is the effectiveness of that infiltration. And part of what we're seeing right now in America by the fact that so many kids go off to college and come out of college as Marxists, and the millennial generation, that generation that's finished college, they are the first sort of generation in American history to be pro-Marxist, and they don't even really know what Marxism is really. But so that's kind of what was happening, this anti-communism. But most people today, if you're talking about Joseph McCarthy, and say, "Oh yeah, witch hunt. He was paranoid. He was a drunk. He hated communists, and he thought he saw one behind every tree and under every rock." But just because he was looking everywhere and seemed a little paranoid doesn't mean there wasn't anything to see. All right. One of the biggest events during that ended in Eisenhower's presidency, and it began under Harry S. Truman, was the Korean War. The Korean War, like I said, was the first sort of hot spark of the Cold War. But it was kind of different in that it was actually fought under the United Nations. So that graphic that you see on the left there, you see the sort of light blue balls coming in. That's actually the United Nations troops. So the truth is the bulk of the troops who were on the ground were American troops. And it was kind of an American war, but it wasn't officially an American war. It was actually a United Nations police action. So the United Nations was formed in 1947, and this is one of the early tests of the United Nations, because here you have why was Korea divided in the first place, right? June 25th, 1950. Why do we have Korea divided on the 38th parallel? Well, because at the end of World War II, after Germany surrendered in Europe, the Soviets turned their attention to Asia, which was the plan all along. That was the plan that FDR and Churchill and Stalin came up with. They said, hey, once we're done defeating Hitler, we're going to turn our attention to defeating the Japanese. So the Soviets moved into China, and they pushed down into the beginning of the Korean Peninsula. And so when World War II ended, just like an iron curtain fell over Europe, this was the bamboo curtain, they call it sometimes, the bamboo curtain that fell across parts of Asia. China and North Korea had become communist. And so this is the dividing line between the part of Korea that was taken over by the communists and the part of Korea that was liberated by the Americans. And so it's a dividing line. It's an artificial dividing line. The Korean people are one people. They speak one language. They have one deep, rich cultural heritage, but they are politically divided. Nobody really likes that, but either side, of course, would like to take over the whole for themselves. So what happens on June 25th, 1950, is that North Korea invades South Korea. North Korea had gotten arms, armament, ammunition, military training, supplies from the Soviet Union and from Communist China, and they burst across the border and they almost completely swallowed up South Korea, which is what they were trying to do. They were trying to completely swallow up South Korea before the world had a chance to react. And they almost succeeded. But China is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they were boycotting the UN Security Council, so they weren't there for the meeting. And in the meeting where they were absent, the United States brought up a resolution to the United Nations and said, do you see what's happening in Korea? We need to put an end to this. And so it passed. The United Nations passed this resolution to stop what was happening in Korea. So September 14th, 1950, you have US-led UN coalition of troops. They come in, and they are able, between September and November of 1950, in the fall of 1950, they push the communist North Koreans back almost to the Chinese border. And in fact, if you look at the third map, and you look at the place where the blue and the red touch, you'll see that they touch right on the Yalu River. So you see that black arrow pushing the blue all the way up? That part of the American military advance does get all the way to the Yalu River. And on the other side is Communist China. And this is where a falling out happens between General Douglas MacArthur and President Harry Truman. General MacArthur thought he knew better than everybody. And he might have, but he needed to remember that he was working for the president and not the other way around. So he believed that he could win this war, but he believed the only way to really win the war would be to take out the Chinese. Truman didn't want to get into a war with the Chinese. The UN authorization did not include the Chinese. China was a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So here's this problem. What you really have is 2 members of the UN's Permanent Security Council, China and the United States. They're really fighting against each other, but they're not, of course, fighting against each other because that wouldn't be okay. And so it's really North Korea, South Korea. So what happens? Well, China enters the war and pushes the UN troops back, and Douglas MacArthur is removed from command, and then it falls into a stalemate. And basically for 2 years, almost 3 years, nothing really happens. And it's sort of a wave of the communists say, okay, we want to cease fire, we want to negotiate peace. And so we would go to Paris and we would negotiate peace with the Koreans, and they would use the peace talks, ceasefire time, as a time to bring reinforcements to the front line and to prepare for the next assault. And then they would storm out of the peace negotiations and attack on the battlefield. And we would say, oh, no, this isn't terrible. And so we'd fight back and we'd stop their attack. And then they'd say, oh, no, we want a ceasefire. We want peace. They did this repeatedly over the course of 2 years before finally it was just a permanent ceasefire. There actually is no peace treaty that ends the Korean War. Technically, it's still going on. It's just a permanent ceasefire along this demilitarized zone that's been there since 1953. North Korea is a communist dictatorship dynasty of the Kim family. It's now the grandson of the original who's leading things in North Korea. It remains a terrible, terrible place to live, probably the worst place on earth to live. So what else happens at home in the 1950s after the Korean War's over? 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education. And this is, again, that Supreme Court decision that ends segregation in public schools. That's the picture on the left. High Court bans segregation in public schools. You see a mother and daughter sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court. But it took time for this to actually take effect. In 1957, you have the Little Rock Nine. You can see them. They're the African-American students in the middle picture. The Little Rock Nine were 9 African-American students who went to Little Rock High School, an all-white high school. Imagine being one of those 9 students. You're African-American, there's 9 of you in a high school of hundreds, and you have to be accompanied to school by soldiers to protect you from being harassed, beaten, maybe killed, because you are breaking through these social barriers that have stood since the end of Reconstruction in 1877. So you're trying to overturn 80 years of history in the South, and it was very bold. And then in 1963, see, it didn't immediately go to the university level everywhere. 1963 it does, and Governor Wallace stood opposed to this. That's him in the suit in the picture on the right, standing between the police officers. So what you actually had was Governor Wallace, the governor of Alabama, with the state police refusing to allow black students to enter into the University of Alabama. And that was a showdown. Of course, the forces of segregation and discrimination lost these battles. But in many parts of the South, what happened for a long period of time, and this is what's not as well known or well discussed, what happened in large parts of the South is that there was voluntary desegregation. In other words, if you were an African-American student and you and your family wanted to go to the white high school or the white school, you could go if you wanted to. Of course, you faced enormous social pressure, discrimination, harassment. But like the Little Rock Nine, you could go if you wanted to. But there still remained all black schools where the majority of black students went because it was safer and it was more comfortable. And it still remained that most of the white schools remained all white. Because basically they said, okay, you can come if you want to. And then they would rely on groups like the KKK to exercise physical intimidation. Firebombing houses, burning crosses on front lawns, lynchings in some cases, although that was rare. But they would basically intimidate all the African American students and say, oh no, we don't want to go to school there. And really, who would? Would you want to be a group of 10 or 15 or 20 African American students in an all-white high school and being harassed and picked on and called names and mocked and ridiculed and discriminated against? I mean, it was hard. So that was actually the case from the 1950s until the late 1970s. Early 1980s in some places, when they then put through forced integration, and that was where they shut down the black schools and they said all students must go to the same school, and that's when things like busing came in the 1970s. So it took a long time, is the bottom line of that. Okay, here's an overview of the space race. The space race begins in 1957. With the Soviets launching Sputnik, which is the first satellite to be put into orbit. This was a huge shock to the world, especially to America. we had been beaten in the race to space by the Soviets. And Sputnik orbited around the world and sent out a little signal, a little ping, that if you had a radio receiver, you could pick it up. And so people in America could watch with a telescope. You could watch Sputnik go by in the night sky, and you could hear the ping, and you knew that thing was put up there by the Soviets. And that was very threatening, because almost immediately people thought, well, if they could put something in the sky that would fly above us, what's to stop them from arming that thing and having it drop bombs on us, right? Which hasn't ever happened, but that was the thought, the fear. The next month, the Soviets put the first dog in orbit. So the first living creature goes into orbit. The dog's name was Laika. Finally, the U.S. responds in January of 1958, several months later, by putting our first satellite up into orbit. And then the first weather satellite for the U.S. in 1959. And then the U.S. puts the first chimp in space in January of 1961. There's some stories about how funny this was, because there were already astronauts training to go into space for America, and then they were replaced by chimpanzees. They're like, what's the point of this? Why, you're saying that we're just basically chimps. And that was kind of a thing back then. But it was the Soviets who, again, put the first human in space. So the Soviets put the first satellite in space, the Soviets put the first animal in space, and the Soviets put the first human in space, all from 1957 to 1961. This is why when John F. Kennedy takes office in 1961, one of the early things he does is challenge America to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which was a remarkable challenge. I mean, people are just starting to go into space, and he says, we're going to go all the way to the moon and put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's something that we're trying to redo now, and it's hard, because there's a lot of risk involved. They were much more willing to take risks back then than we are today. Everything has to be double and triple safety checked these days. But the first pilot-controlled flight was the next month, and that was from America, Alan Shepard. So Yuri Gagarin, when he went up, he was just shot up like the chimp was for America in January. He was just shot up, and he just came right back down. So basically, we could have replaced the chimp with a human and done it first in January, but the Soviets did it first in April. And then in May, we had a pilot-controlled flight. So you imagine this space race. This was really all-consuming to America at this time. And if you've seen Toy Story, you know the story of how things went from Woody to Buzz, right? From Westerns to space. That's kind of mirroring what happened at this time in American history. In the 1950s, it was the Western that was the big cultural icon, the cowboy, right? The Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, Blazing Saddle, all that kind of stuff. And so then in the 1960s, it became space, right? And the astronaut. And cars in the late 50s started to have fins on them because it was like supposed to look like a spaceship, like a 57 Chevy. Excuse me, this is just allergy coughing, by the way. I don't have COVID. All right, so where were we? 1962, the first communications satellite put up by the United States by AT&T. 1965, the Soviets do the first spacewalk, so they're the first ones to do outside of a spacecraft spacewalk. But then the space race kind of ends, July 1969, with the first man on the moon. We could talk way more. I could do a whole class on the space race, but we don't have time. So we're moving on. And we're moving on to Cuba. Why not? If you go to Cuba today, you will see a very funny thing. That's a picture of Cuba today on the left. That's not a picture of Cuba from the 1950s. But if you go to Cuba today, you'll see a bunch of American cars from the 1950s still running around on the streets of Havana. Because the Soviets took over in 1959 and Fidel Castro was their dictator there, the communist regime. And there was an embargo on Cuba from 1959 until just a few years ago. And so they couldn't import automobiles and they didn't make anything. And so all they had were the American cars that were there from the 1950s, and they just had to keep them going. So a lot of them are still on the roads today. So 1959, the Soviets take over Cuba. Now look at the map, and you can see how scary this was for America. We are in the height of the Cold War. I mean, kids at school in the 1950s did nuclear attack drills, where you would get on the floor and you would hide under your desk in the case of an atomic bomb being dropped on you by the Soviets. We were in a real tense situation. We had already fought the war in Korea, right? We were going to be fighting a war in Vietnam, and the communists get to where they are 90 miles off the coast of Florida. From Havana to Miami is about 100 miles. It's pretty close. So they take over in 1959. Kennedy gets elected in 1960. And then 1961, the first year of his presidency, he suffers a humiliating defeat in an episode called the Bay of Pigs. Basically, a bunch of people who had fled Cuba when Castro took over, those who were part of the previous government, who were friendly to the United States and who wanted a democracy, they launched across the water to land in Havana and to take over Cuba. And it was a U.S.-backed operation, and it failed miserably. They were all basically slaughtered on the beaches and never really got that far. One of the big criticisms of Kennedy is that he refused to provide the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba with air support. So he refused to give them real, robust U.S. military support. He basically said, we're behind you. Go on out there. See what you can do. And Cuba had far more advanced weaponry from the Soviet Union than this group of refugees, basically. And they got slaughtered. So that was a horrible defeat for the Cuban-American community, for democracy, and an embarrassment to Kennedy. Many people thought Kennedy was too young to be president, too inexperienced, and in his first year in office, he suffers this major defeat at the Bay of Pigs. Then in 1962, Cuba is thinking, well, they tried to invade us. Who knows if they're going to do it again? We need to defend ourselves, make sure they're never going to try to invade us again. The Soviet Union saying, would it be cool if we had nuclear missiles close enough that we could launch them and strike the United States before the United States had a chance to react? Because you fire off a nuclear missile from Cuba, you can hit basically anything within the United States within minutes, maybe even before the United States has time to react. So the Soviet Union started putting nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. We found out about it, and there was a showdown called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this time Kennedy won. The ships turned around. It was literally the ships were coming from the Soviet Union with the final parts to finish installing the nuclear missiles, and we had U.S. ships there, and they met each other there in the Atlantic Ocean, and they almost fired on each other, almost started World War III, but the Soviet ships turned around and went back home, and it was a literal face-off on the ocean. And so we won the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then it sort of settled into a place where the Castros ruled Cuba, and they still do. Things have taken a better turn a little bit in U.S.-Cuba relations in recent years, but it's still a communist dictatorship, still ruled by the Castros, although they have much more freedom. In Cuba, you have much more religious freedom and much more economic freedom than you would in North Korea. So communism looks different in different countries, for example. Okay, President Kennedy, we've already talked about him. Let's take a brief look at his presidency. He was president from 1961 to 1963. In his inauguration, he gave them one of the most famous lines in any presidential speech, where he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So this was a stirring call. This certainly isn't what we hear from politicians today, is it? You don't hear too many politicians saying those kind of words today. They're basically trying to appeal to people by promising them what the government can do for them. He created the U.S. Peace Corps in 1961. This was a great endeavor to try to send out Americans to be a positive influence in the world. Many critics of Kennedy said it was just a place for draft dodgers. So later in the 1960s, If you didn't want to have to go fight in Vietnam, you could go and be in the Peace Corps. He challenged the U.S. to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. He did that in 1961, and that was realized in 1969. He also cut taxes pretty significantly. Top income rate. Imagine this, the top income tax rate. So any money you made over a certain amount, what you paid a 91% tax rate on that. He cut that to 65%, which is still pretty high. It's only about 37% today, I think. And then he cut the corporate rate from 52% to 47%, which is still pretty high. But these tax cuts led to economic growth and prosperity throughout the 1960s. He stood strong against Cuba in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, but he was also an immoral serial adulterer. He had a number of affairs with a whole line of women, including Marilyn Monroe. One of the creepy things you can find a video of is Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday to the president. And the video itself is, just a little bit strange. But it's really strange when you realize the president actually had an affair with this woman. And here she is publicly singing him happy birthday in a very sort of seductive way. He was not a morally upstanding guy, not a faithful husband. He also appointed his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, which is something that today would not be stood for at all. In fact, this is a very bizarre, really, when you think about it. The Attorney General runs the Department of Justice, which is supposed to have a level of independence from the presidency. And the idea that you have your brother as Attorney General is basically saying, I'm untouchable. No one's going to investigate me because my brother's the Attorney General. And then when that brother turns around and becomes the leading presidential candidate after JFK's assassination, the Kennedys are definitely, let's say, questionable character in terms of moral integrity and corruption, for sure. After Kennedy, after JFK, comes LBJ, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. He's known for basically three things during his presidency, which takes part basically the latter part of the 60s, from 63 to 69. Civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and his war on poverty. In part, he was able to use Kennedy's death to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The strongest opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from within the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats did not want the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but LBJ was a Southern Democrat. He had been the governor of Texas. He was a Texan. So as a Southern Democrat, he was able to put some pressure on it. They still didn't get very many votes from Southern Democrats, but they did get Republican votes and Northern Democrat votes enough to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the most important civil rights legislation in the history of the United States. That's followed up by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally takes real steps to securing the right to vote for African Americans in the South. So African Americans in the South did not really have the right to vote in any practical sense from 1877, when Reconstruction ended, until 1965. So for almost 90 years. He cut both personal income taxes and corporate taxes even more after JFK. So here you have the 1960s. You have two Democratic presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, and they both cut taxes significantly. And their cutting of taxes led to great economic prosperity. He also declared war on poverty, and hasn't been super successful, but we'll talk about that. He created many of what's called the Great Society programs. He said, we need to create a great society for all Americans, basically trying to get everybody out of poverty. And he created the welfare state, Job Corps, Head Start, aid to dependent families with children, lots of things that we associate as the welfare state. Food stamps were created under LBJ. Here's a little bit of a question about how effective that was, okay? So in 1964, that's the dotted line, right? The war on poverty begins. But one thing to note is that poverty was already falling in America when the war on poverty began. The poverty rate was 25% in the year 1947, 50, late 1940s, right? So within the 5 years after the end of World War II, you had a 25% poverty rate. And over the 15 years between 1950 and 1964, the poverty rate fell from 25% to under 20%, to about 18%. And today it sits at about 15%. It's actually lower than that because since Trump took office, this ends in 2012, but since Trump took office, the poverty rate has declined again. But really look at 1964 when it's at 18%, in 2012 when it's at basically 15%. So it's a 3% drop in the poverty rate. We certainly didn't eliminate poverty. Yes, the poverty rate continued to go down after the war on poverty began, but you could say that that was due to the economic expansion that took place in the 1960s because of the tax cuts that both Kennedy and Johnson put in place, and it was already well underway. I mean, look at the line. It was already falling considerably long before the war on poverty began. Another way to look at this is to compare the poverty rate with the amount of money being spent on poverty. So in those first 15 years, right, from 1964 to 1980, that's when the poverty rate fell the most. And that's when more and more money was being spent. But then after that, after 1980, look at what happens. Basically, the poverty rate stays the same, even though spending on poverty relief programs skyrockets. We're spending way more money on welfare relief today than we ever have. And it's not really having much of an effect on the actual welfare rate in America. So there's a limit to how much government welfare can do to lift people out of poverty. All right, 1968, one of the most important years in American history. History.com says the year 1968 remains one of the most tumultuous single years in history, marked by historic achievements, shocking assassinations, a much-hated war, and a spirit of rebellion that swept through countries all around the world. So in January and February of 1968, the year begins with the worst news coming out of Vietnam. Remember, we sent combat troops there first in 1965. 1968, the North Vietnamese lead the Tet Offensive, which was really kind of a desperate attempt to attack everywhere all at once. And the U.S. leadership had said we basically had the North Vietnamese defeated. But the Tet Offensive showed that the war wasn't even close to being over. And we had our worst casualty month in Vietnam in February of 1968. These 2 months began to turn younger Americans against the war. And that's the important thing. You see all these protests against the Vietnam War. You think America hated the Vietnam War. Younger Americans hated the Vietnam War. And they began to really protest against it because they were the ones who were at risk for getting sent over, right? So that's really when the anti-Vietnam War movement begins, is in early 1968. April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And June of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated in an LA hotel right after he won the California primary. He was assassinated by, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray, who was basically a white racist who hated him. Kind of a simple, sad story there. RFK's assassination is more complicated. Sirhan basically was kind of a Palestinian terrorist, and he resented RFK for taking the side of Israel in the 6 Days War in 1967. That was supposedly the reason. There are conspiracy theorists, of course, who would try to link RFK's assassination in 68 with JFK's assassination in 63, and would say basically the same people, the people who didn't want the Kennedys to control the White House, had both of them killed. That's conspiracy theories. You can go down a whole rabbit hole with conspiracy theories. Most of them are not true. In August of 68, there was a very violent Democratic presidential convention. And there was basically the Democratic Party was split by the convention. And the younger people were anti-war, and the older people were trying to support the policies of LBJ in trying to contain communism. This resulted in 1968 November of Richard Nixon being elected president. All right, so we're going to stop there, and we will pick up with the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s next week. So I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that you learned something. And there are videos that I put on the website on Schoology. So on Schoology, in your materials folder, there's a folder within there that has a series of videos that go along with today's class. I would like you to watch those. They're not particularly long. There's a lot of them, but most of them are just those 1-minute president videos that I've shown you in class that I can't really do in this format. So go ahead and watch those, and watch all those videos, and it will let me know who's watched them when. So you are required to watch them, and it will let me know that you have. Okay? Anyway, hope to see you next week. Again, we'll be back here live online for our next class. I will see you then. I look forward to getting your World War II papers, which are due on Saturday. Bye.